Elias Thorne, a man whose cynicism was as meticulously crafted as the blueprints he now pored over, felt the familiar ache in his shoulders. The fluorescent hum of the office, usually a comforting drone, seemed to amplify the late-night silence. Outside, the city lights blurred into a distant, indifferent glow, a stark contrast to the intricate lines and historical annotations on his desk. He was an architect, a master of logic and structure, currently tasked with overseeing the final touches on the ambitious renovation of the old Blackstone Hotel. Now, the Blackstone Tower, a gleaming testament to modern engineering, stood tall, its historical eccentricities supposedly ironed out by steel and glass. Elias had heard the whispers, of course. The building, a grand dame of the city's skyline, had a peculiar history. Unexplained disappearances, strange occurrences, a pervasive sense of unease that clung to its very foundations like a persistent mildew. The old-timers called them urban legends, tales spun to entertain tourists and spook impressionable new hires. Elias, a man who believed only in what he could measure and draw, dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. His focus was on deadlines, on the precise angles and load-bearing walls, not on phantom guests or lingering specters. He was a man of the tangible, and the supernatural was, to him, merely a lack of understanding. The clock on his computer screen blinked 1:47 a.m. A sigh escaped him, heavy with exhaustion. Time to call it a night. He gathered his papers, the rustle of the blueprints loud in the quiet office. The thought of his empty apartment, a sanctuary of predictable order, spurred him towards the main elevators. These were new state-of-the-art machines, installed to replace the creaking, ornate cages of the old hotel. Reliable, efficient, modern. He pressed the down arrow, the illuminated button, a small beacon in the dim hallway. The soft chime of the arriving elevator was a welcome sound. The doors slid open with a whisper, revealing the polished steel and cool, impersonal lighting of the car. Elias stepped inside, pressing the L for lobby. The doors began to close, and the familiar sensation of descent started. But then, something shifted. The smooth glide faltered, a subtle tremor running through the car. The lights flickered, a brief, almost imperceptible stutter, before settling back into their steady glow. Elias frowned, a flicker of annoyance replacing his fatigue. A glitch, perhaps. New systems always had their kinks. He glanced at the floor indicator. It wasn't descending. Instead, the numbers began to climb. 506, 7. Elias pressed the L button again. Harder this time, a sharp jab of his finger. Nothing. The ascent continued, slow and deliberate, past the floors that housed offices and apartments, past the floors that should have been his destination. Then, the impossible. The indicator flashed 13. Elias stared, his brow furrowed in confusion. There was number 13th floor. A building's blueprints, etched into his memory, confirmed it. It was a common architectural superstition, skipping the unlucky number. Yet, here it was, glowing ominously. The elevator slowed, then stopped with a soft, almost reverent sigh. The doors slid open. What greeted him was not the sterile, modern interior of the Blackstone Tower. The hallway stretched before him, dimly lit by sconces that cast long, dancing shadows. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something cloyingly sweet and vaguely metallic, like old blood and forgotten dreams. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern, peeled in places, revealing patches of crumbling plaster. The silence was profound, a suffocating blanket that swallowed any sound, even the distant hum of the city. It was a hallway from a different era, a forgotten wing of the old hotel, perfectly preserved in its decay. A faint, unsettling melody drifted from somewhere within the oppressive quiet. A mournful, almost childlike tune played on an unseen music box. Elias stepped out, his annoyance quickly giving way to a prickle of unease. This had to be a prank. A sophisticated, elaborate prank. He turned to re-enter the elevator, his hand reaching for the door close button. But he froze. Standing at the far end of the hallway, bathed in the dim, flickering light, was a figure. It was a woman, her back to him, her posture slumped, as if in profound exhaustion or despair. Her hair, a familiar shade of auburn, was pulled back in a loose bun, and the cut of her blazer, though slightly rumpled, was undeniably that of Sarah, his colleague from the accounting department. Sarah, who he had seen leave hours ago, complaining about a headache and an early morning meeting. "Sarah?" Elias called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The figure didn't move. A cold dread began to seep into Elias's bones, chilling him far more than the sudden drop in temperature. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a glitch. This was something else entirely. He tried to rationalize, to find a logical explanation for Sarah's presence, for the impossible floor, for the unsettling atmosphere. But the growing silence, the feeling of being watched, and the sight of his colleague, unresponsive and eerily still, began to chip away at his composure. His phone, clutched in his hand, displayed a stark no service message. He was truly alone and trapped. The elevator doors, with a soft, almost imperceptible click, slid shut behind him, sealing him in the impossible reality of the 13th floor. The silence that followed the elevator door's soft click was more deafening than any scream. Elias stood frozen. The image of Sarah's slumped form burned into his retinas, the impossible floor stretching before him. His rational mind, a fortress he had meticulously built over decades, was under siege. He called out Sarah's name again, a desperate plea, but only the oppressive quiet answered. The faint, unsettling melody, like a broken music box, seemed to weave itself into the fabric of the silence, a lullaby of dread. He took a tentative step forward, then another, his architect's eye scanning the details of the hallway. The peeling wallpaper, a faded rose pattern, seemed to writhe in the dim light. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light filtering from a cracked sconce, like tiny, forgotten souls. The air grew colder with each step, a damp, sepulchral chill that seeped into his bones. He reached the spot where Sarah had been, but there was nothing. No impression on the dusty floor, No lingering scent of her perfume. Just the cold, the dust, and the unsettling quiet. The absence was more terrifying than her presence. Driven by a desperate need for answers and a primal urge to escape, Elias began to explore. The hallway branched, leading to several closed doors, each bearing an old-fashioned, tarnished brass number. He tried a handle. It was locked. Another, also locked. The numbers themselves seemed to shimmer, as if not quite fixed in reality. He moved deeper, the unsettling melody growing subtly louder, drawing him towards a wider space. It was a lobby, or what remained of one. Faded velvet armchairs, their stuffing spilling out like forgotten entrails, were arranged around a chipped marble coffee table. A reception desk, heavy and dark, dominated one wall, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. His gaze fell upon an open guest ledger on the desk. The leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. He carefully opened it, the brittle paper threatening to crumble at his touch. Names and dates, meticulously penned in elegant script, filled the pages. Dates from the 1920s, the 30s, even earlier. And then the annotations. Missing, never checked out. Last seen on the 13th? A cold knot tightened in Elias's stomach. These weren't just urban legends. These were real people whose lives had ended here, on this impossible floor. He flipped through more pages, his fingers trembling. He found old photographs, sepia-toned images of smiling families, elegant couples, and stern-faced businessmen, all guests of the Blackstone Hotel. And then a newspaper clipping, brittle and fragile, detailing the mysterious disappearance of a prominent socialite from the hotel in 1928. Another about a bellhop who vanished without a trace. The stories were chillingly familiar, echoing the whispers he had dismissed as folklore. As he absorbed these grim details, a sudden, jarring sound ripped through the silence. The elevator doors, the very ones that had sealed him in, slammed open again, revealing the familiar, modern interior of the car. The fluorescent lights inside flickered, then stabilized, casting a stark, inviting glow into the dusty, anachronistic hallway. Elias's heart leaped. Escape. A way out. He scrambled towards it, a desperate surge of hope propelling him forward. He could see the polished steel, the illuminated buttons, the promise of reality. He lunged, his hand outstretched, almost touching the cool metal of the frame. But just as his fingers brushed the edge, the doors slammed shut with immense force, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the silent floor. The elevator car, a cruel mirage, rapidly ascended out of sight, leaving him even more isolated, more despairing than before. The brief glimpse of salvation, immediately snatched away, was a torment far worse than the initial entrapment. The floor itself seemed to mock him, the faint melody from the music box swelling into a distorted, mocking crescendo. He sank to the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The paranormal manifestations began to intensify. The lights in the lobby flickered wildly, casting grotesque, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and contort into monstrous shapes. Disembodied whispers slithered through the air, just at the edge of his hearing, too fragmented to understand, yet laden with an unbearable sorrow. Cold spots moved through the room like unseen presences brushing past him, leaving goosebumps in their wake. And then the faint, cloying scent of old perfume, mingling with the acrid tongue of cigar smoke, filled the air, a ghostly reminder of lives long past. Driven by a desperate need to understand, to find some logic in this madness, Elias continued his search. He ran his hands along the dusty reception desk, his fingers tracing the ornate carvings. And then he felt it, a slight give, a subtle imperfection in the smooth wood. He pressed, and a hidden compartment sprang open with a soft click. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs and dust, was a small leather-bound diary. Its pages were filled with cramped, elegant handwriting, detailing the terrifying experiences of a former hotel guest, a woman named Eleanor Vance from the 1930s. She wrote of strange occurrences, of the unseen presence on the 13th floor, and of a malevolent entity that fed on despair. Her words were a chilling echo of his own predicament. He devoured the entries, his eyes scanning for any clue, any hint of escape. And then, on the very last page, scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand, was a fresh entry. It was addressed directly to him. His name, Elias Thorne, stood out starkly on the yellowed page. Elias, if you find this, know that it watches. It knows your fears. It will show you what you desire most, only to snatch it away. Do not trust the silence. Do not trust the whispers. It will try to break you with illusions of escape, with promises of what you lost. The mirror shows not what is, but what it wants you to see. The child's laughter is a lure. Do not follow the melody. It seeks to bind you, as it bound us all. Your architectural mind, your need for order, is its greatest feast. Beware the shifting walls. Beware the familiar faces. They are not what they seem. You are not alone, but you are utterly lost. Eleanor Vance. May God have mercy on your soul and on mine. The diary slipped from his numb fingers, clattering softly to the dusty floor. The words addressed to him were a chilling confirmation that this was no random occurrence, no mere malfunction. The entity, whatever it was, had been observing him, perhaps even before he set foot in the building. The diary itself was a conduit, a twisted warning from a past victim, a desperate attempt to save him, or perhaps another layer of the entity's manipulation. Elias tried to use his architectural knowledge, his innate understanding of structure and space, to find a way out. He paced the hallway, looking for hidden doors, emergency exits, anything that defied the impossible reality of the 13th floor. But the floor defied logic. Walls seemed to shift subtly, corridors leading to dead ends that hadn't been there moments before. The faint melody from the music box, once unsettling, now felt like a mocking lullaby, drawing him deeper into its web. Then, from one of the closed rooms down the hallway, a distinct sound emerged. It wasn't a whisper or a moan. It was a child's laughter, clear, innocent, and utterly out of place. It was the sound of pure joy, echoing in a place of pure despair. It was a lure. Elias knew it. The diary had warned him. But the sound, so incongruous, so full of life in this dead place, pulled at something deep within him. He found himself moving towards it, drawn by an irresistible, terrifying curiosity, forcing him to confront the supernatural nature of his predicament and the malevolent intelligence that orchestrated it all. The child's laughter, clear and innocent, was a siren song in the oppressive silence of the 13th floor. Elias, despite the diary's chilling warning, found himself drawn to it, a moth to a flame. His architect's mind, usually so precise, was now a battlefield of logic, warring with an encroaching, terrifying reality. He moved cautiously down the hallway. The faint, unsettling melody of the music box, now a distant echo, replaced by the disquieting sound of childish glee. The air grew heavier, thick with a melancholic chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. He reached the door from which the laughter spilled. It was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness within. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Elias pushed it open. The room was a nursery, frozen in time. A dusty rocking horse stood in the center, its painted eyes staring blankly. A crib, draped in cobwebs, held a faded, tattered blanket. And there, by the window, a small, translucent figure, no older than 5, was playing with a spectral ball of light, giggling softly. It was a girl, her form shimmering, her laughter ethereal. She was one of the spectral residents. Elias watched, mesmerized and terrified. This was not the aggressive, monstrous entity he had braced himself for. This was a child, trapped, reliving a moment of innocent joy in an eternal prison. The profound sorrow that emanated from her was almost unbearable. He saw others then, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. A woman, perpetually gazing out the window, her face etched with a silent, desperate longing. A man, endlessly pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, a look of profound regret on his translucent features. They were echoes, fragments of lives consumed by the 13th floor, forever bound to their final moments. He tried to communicate, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Hello, can you hear me?" The little girl's laughter faltered, her head tilting as if she sensed his presence, but her gaze remained unfocused, distant. The woman at the window turned her head slowly, her eyes, hollow and filled with an ancient grief, briefly met his. A shiver ran down Elias's spine. These were not malevolent spirits, but rather tormented souls, their existence a perpetual torment. As he observed them, Elias began to understand. They were bound to the floor, unable to leave, their despair feeding the malevolent entity that controlled this space. He witnessed a spectral reenactment then, a fleeting, horrifying tableau. The woman at the window, her form solidifying for a terrifying moment, turned from the glass, her face contorted in a silent scream as a shadowy, indistinct form reached for her. The little girl's laughter turned into a choked sob, and she vanished. Then, just as quickly, the scene dissolved, leaving only the melancholic echoes. This was the architect's dilemma. Elias, the man of logic and concrete, was now faced with a reality that shattered his worldview. The 13th floor was not just a physical space. It was a psychic prison, a meticulously crafted trap. He started to piece together clues from Eleanor Vance's diary and these spectral interactions. The entity, he realized, fed on the despair and fear of its trapped inhabitants. His own fear, his own growing despair, was a feast for it. A profound sense of responsibility settled over him. He had to understand this place, and if possible, free these tormented souls. He continued his exploration of the nursery, his gaze drawn to a small wooden music box on a dusty dresser. It was the source of the unsettling melody he had heard. As he reached for it, his hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath the dresser. Curiosity overriding his fear, he pried it open. Inside, nestled in a velvet pouch, was a tarnished silver locket and a folded, brittle piece of parchment. The parchment contained a crude, hand-drawn symbol, a twisted, interlocking knot that seemed to writhe on the page. It was the same symbol Eleanor Vance had mentioned in her diary, the recurring motif in the architecture of the 13th floor. As he held the parchment, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. The air grew heavy, the temperature plummeting. The spectral residents who had been passively reliving their torment now became agitated. Their whispers intensified, no longer fragmented, but forming a chilling chorus of desperate pleas and warnings. "Run! He sees you! Don't touch it!" The little girl's laughter returned, but it was distorted, a high-pitched shriek of terror. And then a new voice, deep and resonant, filled the room, not from the spectral residents, but from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a voice that vibrated in his very bones, a voice that spoke directly into his mind, bypassing his ears. It was the entity. "Welcome, Elias Thorne. Your curiosity is delicious." Elias stumbled back, dropping the parchment and the locket. The malevolent presence was no longer unseen. It was here, in this room, its power palpable, its hunger immense. He had drawn its attention. The symbol, the music box, the diary, they were all threads in a tapestry of torment. And he, Elias Thorne, the cynical architect, was now inextricably woven into its design. The chapter ended with Elias trapped, the entity's presence suffocating, and the chilling realization that his attempts to understand had only made him a more desirable prey. The true game had just begun. He was no longer just an observer. He was a participant in the horror of the 13th. The entity's voice, a chilling symphony of whispers and roars that resonated directly within Elias's mind, was a declaration of war. "Welcome, Elias Thorne. Your curiosity is delicious." His words echoed, not in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones, a profound violation of his inner sanctuary. The air in the nursery grew impossibly heavy, thick with a malevolent presence that pressed down on him, stealing his breath. The spectral residents, previously melancholic and distant, now writhed in silent agony, their translucent forms flickering like dying flames, their whispers turning into a cacophony of desperate, unheard pleas. Elias stumbled back, the silver locket and the parchment with the twisted symbol clattering to the dusty floor. forgotten in the face of this overwhelming, unseen force. This was no longer a game of subtle hauntings. The entity had revealed itself, not in a physical form, but as a palpable, suffocating dread. It was a psychological assault, a direct invasion of his mind. The nursery, moments ago a place of tragic beauty, began to distort. The rocking horse's painted eyes seemed to follow him, its wooden frame twisting into a grotesque parody of a skeletal steed. The faded floral wallpaper pulsed with a sickly, greenish light, the patterns shifting into leering faces that mocked his terror. Elias clamped his hands over his ears, but the entity's voice was internal, inescapable. It amplified his deepest fears, conjuring illusions that preyed on his anxieties. He saw Sarah, his colleague, her face contorted in a silent scream, her eyes accusing him of leaving her behind. He saw his own architectural failures, blueprints crumbling into dust, buildings collapsing around him, all meticulously rendered by the entity's insidious power. Despite the overwhelming psychological torment, a desperate, almost defiant spark ignited within Elias. He was an architect. He understood structure, patterns, weaknesses. He had to find a way out, not just for himself, but for the tormented souls trapped here. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, to push through the suffocating fear. He retrieved the diary and the parchment, his fingers tracing the twisted symbol. This symbol, Eleanor Vance's warnings, the history of disappearances, they were all pieces of a puzzle. He had to unravel the mystery of the 13th floor, not just its physical manifestation, but its very origin. He began to search the room, his eyes now seeing beyond the illusions, seeking the underlying structure. He noticed subtle discrepancies in the molding, a faint line in the floorboards that didn't quite align. The entity, sensing his renewed resolve, intensified its assault. The room began to spin, the walls closing in, then expanding into an infinite void. He felt invisible hands clawing at his throat, a physical manifestation of the entity's desire to choke the life and hope from him. He fought against it, his architectural mind desperately seeking a pattern, a flaw in the entity's design. And then, a voice, different from the entity's, clear and resonant, cut through the chaos. It was the voice of Eleanor Vance, not a whisper, but a direct thought, a memory from the diary that Elias had absorbed. The building was built to hold it, not to keep it out, but to keep it in. Elias froze. The building's true purpose, it wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate trap. He remembered the newspaper clippings, the old photographs. The original architect, a man named Alistair Finch, had been a visionary, but also an eccentric, obsessed with esoteric symbols and ancient rituals. Elias had dismissed it as artistic quirk. Now, a horrifying realization dawned. The 13th floor wasn't a malfunction. It was a carefully constructed cage designed to capture and feed the entity. And Elias, with his architectural knowledge, his inherent understanding of structures, was not accidentally here. He was a fated return, a new piece in the entity's grand design. The entity's voice returned, softer now, almost seductive, a chilling counterpoint to Eleanor's warning. You understand, don't you, Elias? The beauty of it. The perfect design. You, an architect, can appreciate the elegance of my prison. Join me, help me expand. Your knowledge, your vision. Together, we can build an empire of despair. I can offer you escape, power, anything you desire, even the return of what you have lost. The offer hung in the air, a venomous temptation. Elias saw visions of his past, of opportunities missed, of loved ones gone. The entity was offering him a way out, a way to reclaim what he thought was lost, but at what cost? To become an architect of torment, to condemn countless others to the fate of the spectral residents? It was a profound moral dilemma, testing his resolve, revealing a darker side to his character he hadn't known existed. The entity was not just a monster. It was a manipulator, a tempter, preying on his deepest desires. Elias looked at the twisted symbol on the parchment, then at the flickering forms of his spectral residents. He thought of Sarah, still out there, or perhaps already consumed. He thought of Eleanor Vance, her desperate warning. He was an architect, yes, but he was also a man. And he would not be an architect of despair. He would be an architect of freedom. He knew what he had to do. He had to disrupt the entity's power, to sever its connection to the building, to free the trapped souls. It was a desperate plan, a confrontation against an unseen, manipulative force that knew his every fear. The odds were stacked against him, but Elias Thorne, the cynical architect, was no longer just a skeptic. He was a warrior, armed with blueprints and a newfound understanding of the supernatural. The chapter ended with Elias preparing for the ultimate confrontation, knowing that the battle for his soul and the souls of the trapped had truly begun. He would not yield. He would fight fire with fire, structure with counterstructure, and fear with defiance. Elias Thorne, the architect of defiance, stood firm amidst the swirling chaos of the 13th floor. The entity's seductive offer, its insidious whispers of power and reclamation, still echoed in his mind, a venomous temptation. But the spectral residents, their silent pleas and tormented forms, were a stark reminder of the true cost of such a pact. He would not yield. He would fight. His plan, born from a desperate fusion of architectural logic and newfound supernatural understanding, was simple in theory. Disrupt the entity's connection to the building. Sever the threads that bound the 13th floor to its malevolent will. He began by systematically examining the structural elements, searching for the hidden conduits of power, the subtle distortions in the architecture that hinted at the entity's influence. He moved with a renewed sense of purpose, his fear transmuted into a cold, sharp focus. But the 13th floor was not a passive opponent. As Elias began to execute his plan, the floor fought back with a terrifying, intelligent malice. The layout became a constantly shifting labyrinth, designed to disorient, to trap, to break his will. Corridors he had just traversed now led to dead ends, their walls solid and unyielding. Doors he had marked as exits vanished, replaced by seamless stretches of peeling wallpaper. Familiar landmarks, the reception desk, the nursery, seemed to shimmer and distort. appearing in impossible locations, their forms subtly twisted, as if mocking his attempts at navigation. The spectral residents, already agitated, became frantic. Their whispers, once fragmented, now formed a desperate, cacophonous chorus, a symphony of terror. "Don't go that way. It's a trap. He's watching." Their translucent forms flickered violently, their agony palpable, as if the entity was tightening its grip on them, using their torment to fuel its resistance. Elias could feel the immense pressure of the entity's presence, a suffocating weight that pressed down on him, trying to crush his resolve. The psychological torment intensified, blurring the lines between reality and illusion. Elias struggled to differentiate between what was real and what was a cruel trick of the entity's making. He saw Sarah again, not slumped and silent, but alive, vibrant, calling his name from a doorway that led to a sunlit street. He rushed towards her, his heart aching with a desperate longing for escape, for normalcy. But as he reached out, her form dissolved into a swirling vortex of shadows, and the sunlit street transformed into a gaping maw, filled with unseen horrors. The entity tried to make him believe he was already lost, that there was no escape, that his efforts were futile. He stumbled through the shifting corridors, his mind reeling, his body aching. The walls began to weep, not water, but a viscous black liquid that oozed from the cracks, leaving glistening, foul-smelling trails. The floorboards writhed beneath his feet like living things, their groans echoing the tormented whispers of the trapped souls. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and fear, a sickening miasma that clung to his clothes, his skin, his very soul. The labyrinth wasn't just disorienting. It was actively hostile, a living, breathing manifestation of pure malice. He found himself suddenly unable to breathe, his lungs burning, an invisible hand clawing at his throat. He gasped, clawing at his own neck, even though there was nothing there. The entity was physically manifesting its psychological torment, blurring the line between mental and physical suffering. He fought against the invisible constriction, his vision blurring, the room spinning. He was close to succumbing, to giving in to the despair. But then, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper cut through the chaos, not from the agitated residents, but from within himself, a memory of Eleanor Vance's diary. The mirror shows not what is, but what it wants you to see. And then, a fleeting image, a recurring architectural detail from the blueprints he had studied so meticulously, a subtle, almost invisible seam in the wall, a structural anomaly he had dismissed as a minor flaw. It was a moment of clarity, a hidden pathway, perhaps guided by a faint, benevolent whisper from one of the trapped souls, or a subconscious memory of his own architectural genius. He pushed through the illusion, his hand finding the subtle seam. He pressed, and a section of the wall, previously solid, slid inward with a soft click, revealing a narrow, dusty passage. It was a maintenance shaft, a forgotten part of the original hotel's infrastructure, a blind spot in the entity's control. This moment allowed him to make progress on his plan, even if it was small, a tiny victory against an overwhelming force. He squeezed through the opening, the passage barely wide enough for his shoulders. The air here was stale, but free of the oppressive dread of the labyrinth. He could hear the entity's frustrated roar, a sound that shook the very foundations of the building, as if it sensed his escape. He was closer to his goal, but also in greater danger than ever before. The passage led downwards, into the very heart of the building, towards the source of the entity's power. The trap had tightened, but Elias Thorne, the architect, had found a way to slip through the cracks. The chapter ended with Elias descending into the unknown, the entity's fury echoing behind him, knowing that the final confrontation was imminent. The narrow maintenance shaft, a forgotten artery of the old Blackstone, finally opened into a vast, cavernous space. Elias stumbled out, his body aching, his mind reeling from the psychological assault of the shifting labyrinth. This was it, the heart of the 13th floor, the source of the entity's power. The air here was not merely cold, it was a vacuum of despair, thick and suffocating, filled with the accumulated agony of countless trapped souls. It was a place where the veil between worlds was not just thin, but torn wide open. The chamber was immense, yet utterly devoid of any discernible features. No walls, no ceiling, no floor, just an endless, swirling void of deepest black. Yet, within this abyss, Elias could perceive faint, ethereal forms, countless spectral residents, not just the ones he had encountered, but hundreds, thousands, their forms indistinct, their silent screams echoing in the void. They were like stars in a dark galaxy, each a point of concentrated sorrow, their collective despair forming the very fabric of this terrifying space. The oppressive atmosphere was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, threatening to crush him. And then it manifested, not as a single monstrous form, but as a terrifying, abstract presence that defied human comprehension. It was a swirling vortex of shadows, a maelstrom of pure dread that pulsed at the center of the void. Within its depths, Elias could discern fleeting glimpses of eyes, hundreds of them, unblinking and ancient, and mouths, twisted in silent screams, a cacophony of unseen horrors. It was a creature of pure despair, a monstrous, formless entity that embodied the accumulated suffering of all it had consumed. The sheer horror of its appearance was enough to drive a person mad, and Elias felt his sanity fraying at the edges. A thin thread stretched taut against an unimaginable force. "You came, Elias Thorne," the entity's voice boomed, not from a single point, but from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of tormented whispers and guttural roars that vibrated through his very bones. "You seek to disrupt my perfect design, foolish architect. You are but a single fragile thread in my tapestry of despair." This was the battle of wills. Elias, the rational architect, stood against an entity that defied all logic, all reason. He clutched the silver locket and the parchment with the twisted symbol, his only weapons against this overwhelming force. He knew he couldn't fight it physically. This was a battle for his mind, for his soul, and for the souls of the trapped. He focused on the symbol, on the knowledge gleaned from Eleanor Vance's diary. The symbol was a counter-ritual, a way to disrupt the entity's connection to the building, to sever its parasitic hold. But it required a sacrifice, a deep personal fear to be overcome. Elias closed his eyes, and the entity immediately seized the opportunity, projecting his deepest regrets, his greatest failures, the faces of those he loved, twisting them into grotesque parodies. Sarah, her eyes accusing, his parents disappointed, his own reflection distorted and weak. It was psychological warfare designed to break his will, to make him surrender. But Elias held firm. He remembered Eleanor's warning. The mirror shows not what is, but what it wants you to see. He pushed through the illusions, his mind a fortress against the entity's assault. He knew his greatest fear wasn't failure or loss. It was the fear of becoming like the entity, of succumbing to despair, of losing his humanity. And that was the sacrifice. He had to embrace his fear, to acknowledge it, and then to transcend it. He opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on the swirling vortex of shadows. You feed on despair. Elias projected his thoughts, his voice surprisingly strong in the void. But despair is not all that exists. There is hope. There is defiance. As he spoke, a faint, shimmering light began to emanate from the spectral residence, a collective spark of hope, fueled by Elias's defiance. The entity roared, a sound of pure rage and frustration, as if the light was a physical pain. The trapped souls, sensing a chance, began to stir, their whispers turning into a faint, encouraging hum. They were lending him strength, distracting the entity, their collective will a small but growing force against the overwhelming darkness. Elias raised the parchment, the twisted symbol glowing faintly in his hand. He focused his will, his architectural knowledge, on the building's unseen structure, on the invisible threads that bound the entity to this place. He envisioned the symbol as a key, a counter-frequency that would disrupt the entity's hold. He poured his remaining strength, his defiance, his hope into the symbol, a silent prayer for release. The void shrieked. The swirling vortex of shadows convulsed, its form flickering, distorting. The oppressive atmosphere began to crack, thin lines of light appearing in the darkness. The 13th floor shuddered, a deep, resonant tremor that shook the very foundations of the building. The illusions began to crack, revealing glimpses of the familiar, modern skyscraper beneath the decaying facade. The entity was wounded, its connection to the building, to its source of power, weakening. Elias had managed to disrupt its hold, to sever a vital artery. The victory was not absolute. The entity was not destroyed, but it was wounded. And for the first time since he stepped onto the 13th floor, Elias felt a glimmer of something other than despair. Hope. The confrontation was over, for now, but the battle for the Blackstone, and for the souls it held, was far from finished. The void shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, as Elias's will, amplified by the collective spark of the spectral resonance, struck at the heart of the entity. The swirling vortex of shadows convulsed, its form flickering, distorting, as if a great, unseen hand was tearing at its very essence. The oppressive atmosphere began to crack, thin lines of light, like fissures in a dark crystal, appearing in the abyss. The 13th floor shuddered, a deep, resonant tremor that shook the very foundations of the building, a groan of protest from a structure that had long been a willing accomplice to evil. The illusions began to crack, revealing glimpses of the familiar, modern skyscraper beneath the decaying facade, like a mask slipping to reveal the true face beneath. Elias, weakened but alive, felt a profound sense of exhaustion wash over him, but also a surge of exhilaration. He had done it. He had wounded it. The entity was not destroyed, he knew, but its hold on the 13th floor, on the building, was broken. The whispers of the spectral residents, once a chorus of despair, now softened, becoming a faint, almost grateful hum as their forms began to dissipate, their long torment finally coming to an end. Some dissolved into shimmering motes of light, ascending into the newly revealed cracks in the void, while others simply faded, their peace finally found. As the last of the spectral residents vanished, a new, impossible pathway opened before Elias. It wasn't a door or a corridor, but a shimmering, ethereal tunnel of light that pulsed with a gentle, inviting hum. And at its end, the unmistakable gleam of polished steel. The elevator. It had reappeared, not flickering, not distorted, but solid, real, and waiting. Elias stumbled towards it, his legs heavy, his mind a blur of exhaustion and disbelief. He stepped inside, and the doors slid shut with a soft, almost reverent whisper. The descent was disorienting, a blur of floors and time. The numbers on the indicator spun wildly, a kaleidoscope of digits, then settled on L for lobby. The familiar chime sounded, and the doors opened. Elias stepped out, bracing himself for the familiar, sterile lobby of the Blackstone Tower. But what greeted him was not the polished marble and gleaming chrome he remembered. He was standing on a deserted street. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The sky above was a bruised purple, the sun setting behind a jagged line of ancient, snow-capped mountains. The buildings around him were old, made of rough-hewn timber and stone, their windows dark and empty. A narrow, winding river flowed nearby, its waters dark and swift. There were no skyscrapers, no city lights, no familiar landmarks. He was in a place he had never seen before, a place that felt ancient and wild. The elevator had not taken him back to the lobby. It had taken him somewhere else entirely. He checked his phone. No service still blared on the screen, a cruel joke in this desolate landscape. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at his throat. Had he truly escaped? Or had the entity, in its wounded state, merely flung him into another, more subtle prison? He was physically unharmed, but deeply traumatized, the echoes of the 13th floor still reverberating in his mind. The cold air, the scent of decay, the faint, almost imperceptible whisper of the entity's voice. They were all still there, clinging to him like a shroud. He wandered for what felt like hours, the unfamiliar landscape stretching endlessly around him. Just as despair threatened to consume him, he saw it, a small, flickering light in the distance. He walked towards it, his hope rekindled. It led him to a small rustic cabin, smoke curling from its chimney. He knocked hesitantly. The door creaked open, revealing an old woman, her face lined with age, her eyes sharp and knowing. "You're late," she said, her voice raspy, yet kind. "We've been expecting you." Elias stared, bewildered. "Expecting me? Who are you?" She smiled, a faint, knowing smile. "We are the others. The ones who escaped. The ones who found their way out of the 13th. You're not the first, Elias Thorne. And you won't be the last." She led him inside, where a small group of people sat around a crackling fire. Their faces were etched with a similar weariness, a shared understanding of unspeakable horrors. They were survivors, like him. A former hotel guest from the 1950s, a maintenance worker from the 70s, a young woman who had been a tourist in the 90s. They had all been to the 13th floor, and they had all found their way out, not back to their own reality, but to this hidden sanctuary, a place outside of time and space, a refuge for those haunted by the impossible. Elias was not the only survivor. This discovery, while offering a strange sense of camaraderie, also brought a chilling realization. The 13th floor was not an isolated incident. It was a recurring nightmare, a trans-dimensional phenomenon that continued to claim victims across time and space. His escape was not an end, but a new beginning, a new chapter in a battle he had only just begun to understand. The unfinished business of the 13th floor and the entity that controlled it now extended far beyond the confines of a single skyscraper. The rustic cabin, nestled amidst the ancient snow-capped mountains, became Elias Thorne's new reality. The small group of survivors, each bearing the invisible scars of the 13th floor, welcomed him with a quiet understanding that transcended words. They were a motley crew, plucked from different eras and realities, united by a shared horror and an impossible escape. Elias learned their stories, each one a testament to the entity's insidious reach, each one a piece of the terrifying puzzle. He was no longer alone, but the camaraderie, while comforting, was also a chilling reminder of the vastness of the threat. His physical wounds healed, but the psychological ones festered. Elias tried to return to a semblance of normalcy within this strange sanctuary, but he was forever changed. The world, once a predictable canvas of concrete and steel, was now a tapestry woven with unseen threads of malevolence. He saw the world differently, no longer a skeptic. Every shadow held a potential threat, every sudden chill a lingering presence. He experienced residual paranormal phenomena, a flicker of light in the corner of his eye, a whisper carried on the wind that only he could hear, a cold spot in the cabin that no fire could dispel. He was haunted by the faces of the trapped souls, their silent screams echoing in his dreams, their despair a constant companion. But more than the haunting, Elias was consumed by an obsession. The 13th floor, the entity, the very nature of this trans-dimensional horror, it became his life's work. He dedicated himself to understanding and combating such paranormal phenomena. He spent countless hours poring over ancient texts the survivors had collected, studying forgotten rituals, and meticulously drawing diagrams of the building's true, malevolent architecture. He became an amateur paranormal investigator, an architectural historian specializing in haunted structures, a recluse tormented by his experiences, yet driven by an unyielding need to understand. He tried to warn others. He wrote detailed accounts of his ordeal, meticulously documenting every terrifying scene, every psychological torment, every impossible event. He tried to share his findings with the outside world, sending anonymous emails to architectural firms, paranormal research groups, even news outlets. But his story was met with skepticism, disbelief, or outright ridicule. They called him mad, a victim of a vivid hallucination, or a publicity seeker. The world remained largely oblivious to the true horrors lurking beneath the surface of reality, content in its ignorance. His warnings, like Eleanor Vance's, were dismissed, lost in the cacophony of modern life. One frigid morning, as Elias sat by the fire, sketching a new interpretation of the twisted symbol, a tremor ran through the cabin. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Elias felt it in his bones. It was the same tremor he had felt on the 13th floor, the building's groan of protest. He looked up, his gaze drawn to the small, tarnished mirror hanging on the wall. His reflection was there, but behind him, in the depths of the mirror, was not the rustic cabin, but the familiar modern lobby of the Blackstone Tower. And then, a single light flickered on the 13th floor, a malevolent wink in the reflection. The entity was back, or perhaps it had never truly left. The building, he had learned, was scheduled for demolition, a final act of erasure. He had believed that once the physical structure was gone, the entity's influence would wane, that the 13th floor would finally be sealed. But the tremor, the reflection, the flickering light, they were a chilling confirmation. The 13th floor was never truly tied to the physical building. The entity, or the 13th floor itself, was a trans-dimensional phenomenon that could attach itself to any tall structure, or even to Elias himself. His struggle was truly endless. He walked to the window, his gaze fixed on the distant, snow-capped peaks. The battle was never truly over. Evil, he now knew, could always find a way back. The 13th floor might be sealed, its memory fading from the collective consciousness of the world, but its legacy and the possibility of its return lingered. The horror was not just in the supernatural, but in the lasting psychological impact, the knowledge that such darkness existed, and the chilling realization that he, Elias Thorne, was now its eternal sentinel. The final image was Elias, standing vigilant, his eyes scanning the horizon, forever haunted, forever watching for the next ascent of the elevator to the 13th floor.